She immediately understands that the King and Queen have hosted the Duke and Duchess of Sussex with Prince Archie.
5 minutes ago, the doors of an emergency palace meeting opened, and for several seconds, no one came out. Reporters beyond the gates saw an aide cross the courtyard with a red ceremonial folder. Then William appeared beside Catherine. He did not wave or face the cameras. Catherine kept one hand near his arm as though she expected him to stop. No coronation date had been announced. King Charles had not declared an abdication. Yet inside that closed room, according to the scenario now being discussed around the royal household, Charles had authorized a formal review of William's eventual coronation plans. That alone would have been historic. Yet the real danger was hidden in what Charles had already authorized before anyone else entered that room that night. But it was not the detail that changed William's expression. The king had also explained why the review could no longer be delayed, and the reason was written on a single page that Charles initially refused to place inside the official folder. William read that page once. Then he turned it face down, because the emergency meeting was not really about a ceremony. It was about what the palace had quietly begun preparing for before William was told. And by the end of the night, he would discover that his father had already signed one instruction in his name. 1 hour earlier, the summons had reached William and Catherine without the usual explanation. There was no agenda and no request for advisors. They were directed through a secured corridor into a room used for matters too sensitive to reach the wider household. Princess Anne was already seated near the window. That was the first warning, and was rarely brought into an unscheduled meeting merely to discuss pageantry. Her presence usually meant duty, continuity, or a decision Charles wanted tested by someone who would not soften the truth. Camilla sat opposite the king. She had no folder in front of her. That was the second warning. At the center of the table rested a red case sealed with a narrow ribbon. Beside it lay a smaller cream envelope with no royal crest, no type label, and only 2 handwritten words. For William. No one reached for either document. Charles looked around the room, then asked for every telephone to be removed. 2 aides stepped outside. The doors closed. Even the clocks seemed louder. William watched his father rather than the folder. Catherine watched William, and watched everyone. Camilla finally asked the question hanging over the table. Why tonight? Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hand over the cream envelope and said that before they discussed William's future, they had to confront a decision already made in the present. That decision had begun with a confidential continuity briefing delivered several days earlier. Continuity planning sounds technical, but its purpose is simple: ensuring royal duties and constitutional responsibilities continue if the monarch cannot carry the full workload. Charles had received such briefings before. This one was different. It did more than list duties for reassignment. It identified where delay could create confusion, who would receive sensitive papers, speak for the crown, meet senior officials, and prepare William without suggesting the king had stepped aside. Charles resisted the final recommendation. He did not want officials planning his son's coronation as though his own reign had become a countdown. He reportedly called the language cold, premature, and too eager to turn a family's private fear into an institutional timetable. Then something happened during a later briefing. Halfway through a sentence, Charles stopped speaking. His hand closed around the edge of the table. The pause lasted only moments, and he continued before anyone could call for help. But William had been standing near the doorway. He saw it. Charles knew he had seen it. Neither man mentioned it. That evening, Catherine found William alone, staring at an unread page. He said his father had looked smaller for 1 second, not as king, but as a man trying to hide what pride could not admit. The next morning, Charles approved the meeting. But before he agreed to open the coronation review, he added one condition that no advisor had suggested. Back inside the palace room, Charles untied the red folder and turned it toward William. The first pages did not contain a date. They contained questions. How much tradition should remain? Who should stand inside Westminster Abbey? How should the Commonwealth be represented? Should the ceremony emphasize authority, service, faith, unity, or all four? William scanned the headings without touching the pen beside him. Charles said the review was not permission to replace him. It was protection against confusion. He wanted William to shape the ceremony while he could still challenge him, guide him, and explain which traditions carried meaning and which had survived only because no one had dared to question them. Then Charles stated his condition. William's coronation must never be staged as a victory over his father's absence. There would be no language of conquest, no celebration built around the end of another man's reign. The ceremony had to acknowledge that succession could be constitutional for the country and deeply personal for the family. William closed the folder. For a moment, it appeared he might refuse the entire discussion. Instead, he opened it again, turned to the first recommendation, and rejected it. The proposal described a ceremony of extraordinary scale, a longer procession, greater military display, an expanded guest list, and layers of historical pageantry intended to project permanence. William read the page twice. Then he pushed it away. "I will not begin by asking the country to admire excess," he said. The room changed. William did not reject tradition. He rejected the belief that grandeur alone could create legitimacy. He argued that if a ceremony marked a new chapter, the public needed to see service inside it, not merely gold, uniforms, carriages, and distant faces behind palace glass. Catherine went further. She proposed places for emergency workers, charity leaders, young community figures, Commonwealth representatives, and families reflecting life beyond royal walls. Camilla warned that reducing spectacle could make the crown look uncertain at the precise moment it needed to look strongest, and answered before William could. A crown does not become stronger because the procession becomes longer. The silence after that sentence was sharp. Charles looked down at the rejected proposal. Then he looked at William. He was not angry. He was relieved, because the first recommendation had never been the real plan. It had been placed inside the folder as a test. Charles wanted to know whether William would accept a polished proposal because experienced officials had prepared it, or whether he would question advice that confused display with duty. William's refusal gave him the answer. But the test had a second part, and it was not meant for William. Charles turned toward Catherine. He asked what the ceremony should make people feel after the music ended and the balcony emptied. Catherine paused. She said the country should not feel that it had watched a family inherit privilege. It should feel that it had witnessed a family accept obligation. The words landed differently on each person, and nodded. William looked at Catherine as though she had explained something he had been struggling to express. Camilla remained still as Charles included Catherine in future consultations, not merely on appearance, but on community representation, family participation, public tone, and protecting the children. That decision quietly changed the balance of the room. William's future would not be planned around him alone. Charles said the monarchy would need to show partnership, not isolation. Catherine was not to stand beside William as decoration. She would help determine how the future crown spoke, listened, and presented responsibility to the public. William was visibly uncomfortable hearing her described in the language of a future queen, while his father sat only feet away. Catherine placed her hand near his. "Preparation is not desire," she said. "It is making sure you never carry it alone." Then Charles raised the question of George. One draft proposed giving the young prince a prominent ceremonial role, a visual symbol of 3 generations and the future line of succession. Catherine's answer was immediate. George could participate, but he would not be used to reassure adults at the cost of his childhood. Charlotte and Louis would be protected by the same rule. No child would be made to behave as though the family had already suffered a loss that had not occurred. Charles agreed. Camilla looked toward the sealed cream envelope. She had realized something the others had not. The folder described the future ceremony. The envelope explained why Charles had begun rearranging the present. Before anyone could ask, there was a quiet knock at the door. An aide entered carrying a revised schedule. Charles read the first page, signed the bottom, and handed it directly to William. At first, the changes appeared ordinary. additional briefings, military meetings, charity engagements, and constitutional discussions. Then William noticed 3 markings in the margin. His office would begin receiving selected papers earlier. He would attend one meeting previously reserved for the sovereign, and a set of contingency briefings would no longer list him as an observer. It listed him as the principal. Royal authority rarely shifts with trumpets. It moves through calendars, folders, access, and the order in which names appear on a page. William stared at the schedule. To an official, the changes meant readiness. To a son, they looked like pieces of his father's life being measured, labeled, and moved toward him. Catherine told him that helping Charles carry the weight was not the same as taking the crown from him, and treated the changes as necessary. Camilla saw the danger in them. Information that once moved through Charles and then outward would now reach William directly. Preparation could become influence long before anyone used the word transition. Then William turned the page. At the bottom was an earlier instruction bearing Charles's signature. It had been approved 48 hours before the emergency meeting. William had not been consulted, and the instruction authorized his office to receive a private weekly briefing on matters linked to continuity, national ceremonies, and the king's essential duties. The meeting had not begun the shift. It had revealed that the shift was already underway. Camilla asked Charles why the family had been informed after the order was signed. Her voice was controlled, but the question carried more than procedure. She feared that decisions once discussed with her were now moving around her. Charles answered quietly, because asking permission would have turned protection into negotiation. The words struck the room. Camilla looked less angry than wounded. Catherine understood, but also saw why Charles had acted. If every change became a family contest, the monarchy would hesitate when it needed clarity. Charles asked and to remain with Camilla. Then he asked Catherine to wait outside. The officials left until only father and son remained. The red folder stayed open between them. The cream envelope did not. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Charles finally admitted that he had delayed the review because every coronation page forced him to imagine a future in which William stood before the country and could no longer turn to him afterward. He apologized that preparation had arrived through uncertainty instead of a calm conversation years from now. William lowered his head. He said the ceremony did not frighten him. The title did not frighten him. What frightened him was reaching that day and realizing there was no longer anyone in the room who could answer him as a father rather than a courtier. The distance between king and heir disappeared. Charles reached across the table and placed his hand over William's. Then he pushed the cream envelope toward him. Inside was not a medical report, an abdication draft, or a coronation date. It was a handwritten instruction. Do not become a copy of me. Charles told William that tradition should guide him, never imprison him. His eventual coronation could honor history, but it must explain why the monarchy still deserved to serve. It could not be a performance built only to prove that the institution had survived another loss. He asked William to protect Catherine from being reduced to an image beside the throne. She was not decoration. She was the person most capable of reminding him that duty without humanity eventually becomes distance. The children had to be protected as well. George, Charlotte, and Louis could understand their future gradually. They must never be forced to carry adult fear for the comfort of the public. Charles asked that Camilla be treated with dignity during any future transition, and Edward were to remain pillars of continuity, not figures pushed aside by a new court eager to prove itself. William listened. Then he made one request. No public date, no countdown, no briefing designed to imply that Charles's reign had already ended. Charles agreed. The framework would continue quietly. But as William stood, Charles revealed the final reason the preparations had begun now. He did not fear that William was unready. He feared that the palace would wait until William had no father left to prepare him. Outside the room, Catherine saw the envelope in William's hand and understood that something had changed. She did not ask what was written inside. She simply walked beside him. By the time they crossed the courtyard, Reporters had filled the pavement beyond the gates. No announcement had been made. Yet one visible detail immediately drew attention. The official car waiting for William carried a locked red dispatch case usually associated with the most sensitive royal papers. An aide placed it inside before William entered. It did not prove a transfer of power, but it showed that the heir had left the meeting carrying new responsibilities he had not brought into it. That evening, the palace issued a carefully worded statement about continuity, service, and long-term preparation. It confirmed no date, no abdication, and no immediate change to the king's position. Charles remained king. William remained heir. Yet the relationship between those two roles had shifted. William had accepted preparation without celebrating what it represented. Catherine had accepted influence without treating it as status, and had defended duty over spectacle. Camilla, wounded by the speed of events, had begun to understand that preparation was not betrayal. The red folder remained private. The handwritten instruction remained with William, and the timeline remained unspoken. But one truth could no longer be hidden. A crown does not begin to move when it is placed on another person's head. It begins to move when one generation stops protecting the next from responsibility and starts trusting them with it. So when William's eventual coronation comes, should it remain a display of ancient tradition, or become a modern promise built around service, unity, and the people beyond the palace gates?